The Arizona sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, red earth with an intensity that warped the air. For Jake Callahan, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-creased lines and hard-lived years, it was just another Tuesday. He leaned against the rough bark of a skeletal mesquite tree, the brim of his sweat-stained hat pulled low, watching the last of his meager herd of cattle graze on sparse, sun-scorched grass. Beside him, panting softly in the sliver of shade, lay Rusty, a blue heeler mix whose loyalty was as boundless as the sky above them. Rusty wasn't just a dog. He was a silent partner in Jake's slow, grinding defeat. He was the warm presence on cold nights in the small, drafty cabin, and the unwavering companion in the vast, crushing loneliness of the range. Every line on Jake's face told a story of loss. The ranch his father built, slowly being choked by debt. The wife who left for a softer life in the city. The dreams that had long since turned to dust. All he had left were these few cows, this unforgiving land, and the dog at his feet. "Not much left for us out here, is there, boy?" Jake murmured, his voice raspy from disuse. Rusty's tail gave a hopeful thump-thump against the dry ground, his amber eyes fixed on his master. Suddenly, Rusty's head shot up. His ears, previously flopped in the heat, were now rigid, swiveling like tiny satellites. A low growl rumbled in his chest before he sprang to his feet, every muscle tensed. He wasn't looking at the cattle or the distant horizon. His gaze was locked on the mouth of a narrow, jagged canyon just a few hundred yards away, a place Jake usually avoided. The terrain was treacherous, a maze of shifting scree and sharp rock that could lame a cow or a horse in an instant. "Easy, boy, probably just a coyote," Jake said, pushing himself off the tree. But this wasn't Rusty's usual coyote alert. There was a frantic urgency in his stance. Before Jake could grab his collar, Rusty exploded into motion. He wasn't herding or chasing. He was running with a singular, desperate purpose, a blur of blue-gray fur against the red rock, straight into the canyon's maw. "Rusty, get back here." "Damn it, dog!" Jake's yell was swallowed by the canyon walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the oppressive heat. Losing a cow was one thing, losing Rusty was unthinkable. Cursing, Jake grabbed his canteen and started after him, his worn boots slipping on the loose gravel. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, casting the path in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The air grew still, the silence broken only by his own heavy breathing and the scuff of his boots. He called the dog's name again and again, his voice echoing back, empty and mocking. He pushed deeper, rounding a tight bend where the path was nearly swallowed by a rock slide. The heat was suffocating, and a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. What had the dog seen? A mountain lion? A rattlesnake? Then he heard it. A frantic, insistent barking, echoing from just around the next outcrop. It wasn't a bark of aggression or fear, but of discovery. Jake scrambled over a pile of sun-bleached rocks, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, in a small, hidden basin, was Rusty. He was alive and well, his tail wagging furiously. But he wasn't cornering an animal. He was standing before the collapsed corner of a structure, something man-made and ancient, nearly consumed by the earth and scrub brush. All Jake could clearly make out was a section of a wall made of rusted, corrugated tin, glinting dully under the relentless sun. Jake approached the shack with the slow, deliberate steps of a man used to dealing with unpredictable livestock and hidden rattlesnakes. The sun beat down on the corrugated tin roof, making the air around it shimmer with heat. Rusty stayed close to his heels, letting out a low, intermittent whine, his earlier excitement replaced by a palpable sense of caution. The structure was a wreck, leaning precariously as if a strong gust of wind might finally push it over. Its wooden walls were bleached gray and splintered, and the single window was a dark, jagged maw of broken glass. The door, or what was left of it, hung from a single rusted hinge, blocked by a pile of rocks and debris from the same slide that had likely hidden it for decades. "Easy now, boy," Jake murmured, more to himself than to the dog. He placed a hand on the sun-warmed tin, feeling its flimsiness. There was no forcing the door. He circled the small building, his boots crunching on loose scree. The back wall was more sheltered, pressed against the canyon rock. Here, a section of the wooden planks had rotted through, leaving an opening just large enough to squeeze through if he was careful. He hesitated for a moment, the primal part of his brain screaming about collapsed structures and venomous creatures seeking shade. But Rusty's insistence and a deeper, gnawing curiosity pushed him forward. He dropped to his hands and knees, peering into the darkness. After his eyes adjusted, he could make out a dirt floor and the faint outlines of objects within. He took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of dust, dry rot, and something metallic and ancient. He slid through the opening, the rough wood snagging at his denim shirt. Inside, it was like stepping into a forgotten tomb. A single beam of light cut through a hole in the roof, illuminating a swirling universe of dust motes. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind outside. In one corner sat a simple cot, the frame rusted, and the canvas mattress long since disintegrated into tatters. Beside it, a small, overturned crate served as a nightstand, with a tarnished tin cup lying on its side. Leaning against the far wall was a pickaxe, its wooden handle smooth from use, its head caked with dried mud. A life had been lived here, a hard and solitary one. Jake's gaze fell upon a pair of worn-out leather boots, coated in a thick layer of dust, standing near the doorway as if their owner had just stepped out and was expected back any minute. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, despite the oppressive heat. He moved carefully toward the center of the one-room shack, his boots making soft thuds on the packed earth floor. He nudged a pile of rags with his toe, revealing the yellowed, brittle corner of a newspaper. He bent down, but the paper crumbled to dust at his touch. As he stood up, his heel came down hard on a section of the floor that felt different. It wasn't packed earth, it was wood, and it gave way slightly with a hollow thump that echoed in the small space. He froze, listening. Rusty, who had remained outside, began to bark again, a sharp, insistent sound. Jake knelt, brushing away decades of dirt and grime. His fingers traced the outline of a single, wide floorboard, clearly out of place. It wasn't nailed down like a proper floor. It was a lid. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the shack. His gaze was fixed on the loose floorboard, the dark gap beneath it holding a world of possibilities. For a moment, he was paralyzed by a potent cocktail of fear and hope. Fear of what he might find, a nest of scorpions, a coiled rattlesnake, or worse, nothing at all, just a cruel trick of rotting wood. But the hope was stronger, a desperate, irrational flicker that whispered of a solution to the foreclosure notices and sleepless nights. The bank didn't care about his family's legacy, they only cared about numbers on a page. This could change the numbers. He knelt, the dry wood groaning under his weight. His fingers, calloused from years of working rope and leather, trembled as he hooked them under the edge of the plank. It resisted, wedged tight by decades of dust and shifting foundations. Grunting with effort, he scanned the dim interior. The old prospector's pickaxe leaned against the wall, its head coated in a film of rust, but its hickory handle still solid. It felt strangely right, using the old man's tool to unearth his final secret. He wedged the pointed end of the pickaxe into the crack and leaned back, using his full weight as leverage. With a sharp crack that echoed like a gunshot, the board splintered and popped free, sending a cloud of acrid dust into the air. Jake coughed, waving the dust away. In the hollow space below, nestled in the compacted earth, sat a dark metal box. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of a shoebox, but it was bound with iron straps and fastened with a heavy, rusted padlock. It was real. His breath hitched. This was no empty space. It was a deliberate cache hidden with purpose. He lifted it out. The weight was surprising, far heavier than he expected, and the cold, solid reality of it sent a fresh jolt through him. He set it down on the floor, running a hand over its pitted surface. The lock was a solid mass of corrosion. There was no key, no combination. There was only one way in. Taking the pickaxe again, he positioned its tip against the lock's hasp. His first strike glanced off with a dull clang. His second, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, struck true. The rusted metal shrieked in protest. He hit it again, and again, each blow echoing his own pounding heart. On the fifth strike, the hasp groaned, bent, and finally snapped. The lid was stiff. He pried it open with his fingertips, the hinges screaming as they moved for the first time in what must have been a lifetime. He held his breath and lifted the lid. Time seemed to stop. The interior wasn't filled with papers or keepsakes. It was packed with dull, yellow rocks. Gold. Not fine dust, but raw, heavy nuggets, ranging from the size of a pebble to one hefty chunk as big as his fist. They weren't shiny like in the movies. They were muted, covered in a fine layer of dirt, but their dense, unmistakable gleam absorbed the slivers of sunlight piercing the walls. An involuntary gasp escaped his lips. He reached in, his hand shaking, and picked up a nugget. It was cool to the touch and shockingly heavy, a solid, tangible piece of fortune resting in his palm. Tucked into a corner, almost hidden beneath the gold, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Carefully, he lifted it out and unwrapped it to reveal a slim, leather-bound journal. Its cover was weathered and stained, but it was intact. He sat there on the dusty floor, the impossible weight of gold in the box before him and the story of its owner resting in his hand. The crushing weight of his debts was suddenly replaced by a new, more complex gravity. This wasn't just a solution, it was a legacy, a life, a secret he was now a part of. The initial tidal wave of shock receded, leaving Jake stranded on the shore of a bewildering new reality. The gold, shimmering in the dusty light, was no longer just a fantastical image, but a solid, tangible weight in his hands and in his mind. The rough, pitted surfaces of the nuggets felt ancient, each one a compressed story of time and pressure. He ran a trembling hand through the pile, the metallic clinking echoing in the profound silence of the shack. This was the answer to his prayers, the solution to the foreclosure notices and the sleepless nights. But as he looked from the treasure to the desolate cot and the worn-out pickaxe, a different feeling began to surface, a deep, unsettling sense of intrusion. He wasn't just a discoverer, he was an interloper in another man's life. His gaze fell upon the small, leather-bound journal. It seemed to hold more gravity than all the gold combined. Gently, he lifted it from the box. The leather was cracked and stiff, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. A faint, musty smell of earth and time rose from it. Sitting on the edge of the groaning cot, Jake carefully opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was a slanted, surprisingly neat script, faded but still legible. October 12, 1888. My name is Elias Thorne. I have left the damp chill of Pennsylvania behind for the furnace of this Arizona territory. They say there is gold in these hills, enough to build a new life. I have only my mule, my tools, and a hope that burns hotter than the midday sun. I will not fail. Jake's breath hitched. Elias Thorne. The man suddenly had a name, a history. He turned the page, then another, his eyes scanning the entries that documented months of grueling, solitary labor. Elias wrote of collapsing tunnels, of dwindling supplies, of a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical presence. He described the searing heat of summer and the biting cold of winter nights spent huddled under a thin blanket, dreaming of a home he'd left behind. April 7, 1889. The canyon is a cruel mistress. She offers whispers of wealth, but delivers only sweat and aching bones. Some days, the only sound is the ringing of my own pickaxe and the frantic beating of my own heart. I fear I am forgetting the sound of another man's voice. Jake felt a powerful kinship with the long-dead prospector. He understood the struggle, the feeling of the land both providing for you and trying to break you. He kept reading, his own problems fading into the background as Elia's story unfolded. Then he came to an entry that made his heart pound. September 2, 1890. I have found it. A vein, not a whisper, but a roar. The rock bled gold today. After 2 years of dust and despair, my fortune has begun. The work will be harder now, but it is no longer fueled by hope alone, but by certainty. The journal chronicled the next few years of Elia's secret toil, pulling the treasure from the earth piece by piece. But the tone of the entries began to shift. The initial elation was replaced by a weary sense of burden. March 14, 1894. The box is nearly full, more than I had ever dreamed. But the work has hollowed me out, and my hands tremble with more than just age. I look at this gold and see not a future, but a life already spent. If another soul should find this, know it was earned not with greed, but with a dream of building something that lasts. May it not become a curse. Jake closed the journal, the final words hanging in the air. A curse. The gold suddenly felt cold. This wasn't just found money, it was the sum of a man's life, his sacrifice, his loneliness. Taking it felt less like a rescue and more like a theft. He looked at the heavy box, his mind a whirlwind of conflict. He couldn't just cash it in and pay off his debts. Not now, not after knowing Elias Thorne. Carefully, he placed the journal back in the box, closed the heavy lid, and lowered it back into the dark space beneath the floor. He slid the loose board back into place, the dust settling over the secret once more. He would take the journal for now. That was all. The gold and the ghost of the man who dug it could wait. The ride back to the ranch was different. The familiar weight of the saddle felt heavier, and the setting sun, which usually painted the landscape in comforting shades of orange and purple, now seemed to cast long, questioning shadows. Jake kept one hand on the worn leather of Elias Thorne's journal, tucked safely in his saddlebag, as if it were a fragile artifact. Rusty trotted faithfully beside his horse, occasionally looking up as if sensing the profound shift in his owner's demeanor. The silence of the desert, once a source of peace, was now filled with the echoes of a dead man's words, a life of relentless toil and crushing loneliness. Back at his small, weathered ranch house, Jake unsaddled his horse with mechanical efficiency, his mind 1,000 miles and 100 years away. He fed Rusty, poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot on the stove, and sat down at his simple wooden table. The foreclosure notice on the counter, which had been the singular focus of his anxiety for weeks, now looked like a trivial complaint. His problems felt small, temporary, when measured against the decades of sacrifice contained within the journal he now opened under the dim kitchen light. He started where he'd left off, the entries growing shorter, the handwriting more strained. Elias wrote of failing health, of a persistent cough that rattled his bones, and of the gnawing fear that he would die before he could see his dream realized. The last few pages were the most heart-wrenching. Elias revealed he wasn't just digging for wealth, he was digging for redemption. He had a younger sister, Sarah, whom he'd left behind in Prescott when he caught gold fever. He'd promised to send for her, to give her a life free of hardship. The shame of my silence has been a heavier burden than any rock I've carried, one entry read. I wrote to her for years, but the letters stopped coming back. I fear she believes I abandoned her for riches. This gold is not for me. It is for her children if she has them. It is my apology, my legacy. I pray it reaches her, that she might one day stand in a proper house, a home built not of sweat and dust, but of a brother's love, however late it may be. The final entry was barely legible, a weak scrawl dated 1898. The canyon has taken my strength. I can no longer lift the pick. The gold is secure. My only regret is Sarah. Find her. Prescott, the name is Thorne. Do right by this. Don't let it become a curse. Jake closed the journal, his throat tight. It wasn't just gold in that box. It was a man's last hope, a final, desperate plea for forgiveness. The weight of it settled deep in his soul. Selling the gold to save his ranch now felt like a betrayal, a desecration of Elias' memory. The prospector's quest had ended in that shack, but now, somehow, it had become his. The path forward was no longer about his own survival. It was about honoring a promise made over a century ago. He stood up, a new resolve hardening his features. First thing in the morning, he would drive to Prescott. He had to check the county archives, the old census records, anything that might point to a Sarah Thorne. He owed Elias that much. The drive to Prescott felt like crossing into another world. Jake's old pickup truck rattled along the highway. leaving the familiar dusty reds and sparse, sun-baked vegetation of his ranch for the cooler air and pine-covered hills of the mountains. He'd left Rusty in the care of his neighbor, a retired rancher named Hank, and the silence in the cab was a heavy, unfamiliar weight. Prescott was a living photograph of the Old West, with its historic Victorian homes and the iconic whiskey row lining the courthouse square. For a man accustomed to the immense, quiet solitude of the open range, the bustle of the small city, with its tourists and traffic, felt both overwhelming and strangely confining. His first stop was the Yavapai County Courthouse, a grand stone building that seemed to anchor the entire town. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old paper. Jake, feeling out of place in his worn jeans and dusty boots, was directed to the archives in the basement. The room was a stark contrast to the sun-drenched canyon where his journey began. It was a place of hushed reverence, filled with rows of metal shelves groaning under the weight of thick, leather-bound ledgers. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of a ventilation system. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver hair pinned neatly in a bun looked up from a large desk as he entered. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. "I hope so, ma'am," Jake began, turning his hat in his hands. "My name's Jake Callahan. I'm looking for information on a woman who lived here, a long time ago. Her name was Sarah Thorne." The archivist, who introduced herself as Alina Vance, gave him a patient smile. "Thorne, that's a start. Do you have a time frame?" "Late 1800s. Maybe around 1890. Jake offered, feeling the vagueness of his request hang in the air. Alina's smile didn't falter. "That's the challenge and the fun of it. Records from that period can be scattered. Let's start with the census logs and property deeds." For the next several hours, Jake was lost in a world of scrolling microfiche and delicate, yellowed paper. The work was painstaking. His eyes burned from staring at the glowing screen, deciphering the elegant but often faded cursive of a bygone era. He found several Thorns, but none with a clear connection to a Sarah of the right age. The frustration began to mount, a quiet desperation creeping in. He was a man of action, used to mending fences and working the land. This meticulous, intellectual search felt like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. Seeing his shoulders slump, Alina walked over. She'd been watching him, impressed by his quiet persistence. "It's like looking for one specific stone in a dry riverbed, isn't it?" she said gently. "Sometimes you need to look for what it's next to. Let's check the marriage licenses for that period. A woman's name often vanishes into her husband's." She pulled out a different ledger, its pages as fragile as a butterfly's wing. Together, they scanned the columns, finger tracing down the lists of names. And then, Alina stopped. "Here," she whispered, her voice filled with the quiet excitement of discovery. "Look!" Jake leaned in. There, recorded in crisp, unfaded ink, was the entry, October 12, 1892, Daniel Miller and Sarah Thorne. The name felt like a thunderclap in the silent room. Sarah Thorne hadn't vanished, she had become Sarah Miller. It wasn't the end of the search, but it was a new beginning, a solid, tangible thread he could follow. He looked at Alina, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you." The name Miller was the key that unlocked a century of silence. With Alina's expert guidance, Jake plunged back into the archives, the dusty scent of old paper now feeling less like a tomb and more like a treasure map. They moved from the marriage ledger to birth records, their fingers tracing the faint, elegant script that chronicled the lives of Sarah and Daniel Miller. A son, Thomas, was born in 1894. Then a daughter, Evelyn, in 1897. The trail was warming. They cross-referenced names with census data and property deeds, a slow, methodical process that felt like piecing together a forgotten history. Finally, Alina pointed a triumphant finger at a line in a thick property ledger from 1955. "Here," she whispered, her voice filled with excitement. Thomas Miller's daughter, Clara, inherited the family home at 127 Elm Street, and according to the tax records, she's still the registered owner. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. A living descendant. The idea felt both momentous and terrifying. He thanked Elinor profusely, her warm smile giving him a final surge of confidence. He found himself on a quiet, tree-lined street in an older part of Prescott, standing before a modest but lovingly maintained clapboard house. A small garden of resilient desert flowers bloomed by the porch. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her late 80s, her eyes sharp and intelligent despite the network of fine lines around them. She looked at Jake, a dusty cowboy on her doorstep, with a polite but wary curiosity. "Ma'am, my name is Jake Callahan. This is going to sound strange, but are you by any chance related to a woman named Sarah Thorne?" Clara Miller's expression tightened. "She was my grandmother." "Why do you ask?" Jake's words tumbled out, the story of Rusty, the canyon, the shack, and the lockbox. He saw the skepticism harden in her eyes, so he carefully pulled Elia's journal from his saddlebag. "He left this," Jake said, holding it out. "His name was Elias Thorne. He was your great-uncle." Clara hesitated, then took the journal, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the worn leather. She opened it, her eyes scanning the faded ink. Jake waited, the silence stretching between them. He pointed to a passage he'd bookmarked. "He wrote about Sarah's favorite blue ribbon she wore in her hair," Jake said quietly, "and how she loved the smell of rain in the desert. He was sorry he never got to say goodbye." A tear traced a path down Clara's wrinkled cheek. "My grandmother, she spoke of a brother who went chasing gold. She thought he'd died out in the mountains." She looked up at Jake, her skepticism replaced by a profound, dawning emotion. "All these years?" He explained where the shack was and that the gold was still there, untouched. It was hers, Elia's final gift to his family. The gratitude in her eyes was more valuable than any nugget. After sharing a cup of coffee and listening to stories of the grandmother Elias never saw again, Jake finally took his leave. The drive back to his ranch was different. The setting sun no longer felt like a harbinger of failure, but a promise of a new day. He hadn't saved his ranch with a sudden fortune, but he had saved something more important, a man's legacy. He stepped out of his truck, Rusty bounding over to greet him. Jake knelt, ruffling the dog's ears as he looked out at his land. The threat of the bank was still real, but the weight of despair had lifted, replaced by a quiet, unshakable sense of peace. He had faced his hardship not with gold, but with integrity. And for the first time in a long time, Jake Callahan felt truly rich.